So right now the incentives are geared towards self-preservation or idea preservation.
Yeah.
And what can be done to fix this? One of the questions that I had from the audience was, let's imagine there are some wacky ideas. Obviously, you don't want to let in just any idea. There is something to be said about being too fringe, but then there is something to be said about having permeable walls. So
Right.
how do you fix this system, quote unquote?
Well, very easily. You basically evaluate each idea on its merit. The point is, you are not evaluating the person that mentioned the idea. You're not using, the personal traits as a way of dismissing an idea. Which is very often done. Very often the attacks are personal. If you see in politics, it's very common. In science, it should not be the case. In science, we should argue about the ideas, and if an idea doesn't make sense, you can easily prove that. Um, so let me give you a counter, like an example that comes from the opposite side. So, for example, with respect to Oumuamua, I suggested that it may be of artificial origin as a possibility, and that encountered a lot of opposition. Now, the latest alternative to that was that maybe it is a nitrogen iceberg. That was a suggestion, and you can find nitrogen, pure nitrogen, as you need in this case, in order to explain the fact we haven't seen a cometary tail around Oumuamua, and also that it's flat and that it was pushed away from the sun. All of these facts will come into we could be explained if it was made of pure nitrogen. And pure nitrogen, for example, exists on the surface of Pluto. So the suggestion was, let's imagine a lot of Plutos around other stars, and you chip off their surface with a high efficiency, more than 10%. Of all the Plutos are being chipped off. And then you send out these rocks, and one of them is Oumuamua. And okay, I said, fine. And then I wrote a paper just a week and a half ago saying, well, if you imagine that to be the case, and you end up needing more mass than you have in stars in the Milky Way galaxy, by a factor of 100, actually, it turns out. And so it's
What do you
just
mean by that? Sorry, what do you mean by that? And are you referring to
okay,
the work by Desk and Jackson, I believe?
Dash and Jackson, yes, exactly. And the reason for that is, the layer of pure nitrogen on the surface of Pluto is relatively thin. So it just makes a few percent of the mass of Pluto. Most of the mass is, in rock and water, ice, and so forth. You lose by that, and then so for every bit of nitrogen that you produce, you need much more rock and water, ice, to exist. And then on top of that, you need hydrogen and helium that are much more abundant than rock. So if you do that, just the mass budget, how much mass do you need to process in order to make enough objects so that you would see one of them as Oumuamua? And we know that you need to produce a certain, number of such objects per unit volume so that we would see one of them coming within a few years of the time that we were observing the sky, with Pan stars. So basically, if you just go through the math, which is really simple, straightforward, and also they required that it would, this object would be just 500 million years old, because otherwise it would get completely evaporated. So if you put all of these considerations together, you find that you need 100 times more mass than you have available in stars. So even if you take all the mass in stars, multiply by 100, only then you will have enough surface layers of exoplutos or Pluto-like planets around other stars to make enough objects like Oumuamua so that you would see one of them during that mode of observations. And so to me, it makes this scenario very unlikely. So I just mentioned that, as an example of how a scientific debate should go. Someone proposes an idea, and then you discuss the idea on its merit. And if you do a calculation that shows that something is problematic with that, that is a reason for concern and for working on something else. So that is a scientific debate. On the other hand, if someone goes to Twitter and says something negative about a paper and just doesn't even read it, or says something negative about a person, without referring to the details of the idea, or says something negative about the reference list of a paper rather than the content of the paper, that is not a viable scientific discussion. So my point is, we can maintain a high level of integrity in the scientific process if we just refer to the ideas rather than attack people personally. And that's the way we should proceed. And most of the time in science, you have to understand, most of the time things are uncertain. We just don't have enough evidence. And therefore, we should contemplate possibilities. And that's legitimate. That's part of the scientific process. You can't skip that step. You can't say, I know the answer, and I don't want to dismiss other possibilities, even though there is not enough evidence for your answer to be right. I think it's good to have ideas on the table that are viable scientifically, because then we are exploring all possibilities. And by the way, imagination is extremely important, because we can't just always restrict our attention to things that we know from the past. We will never discover new things that way.
What's Jackson's and Dash's response to this?
I don't know. All I've seen are personal attacks, not necessarily from them, but from other people.
Mm-hmm. And is that the social pressure that you were referring to before, that previously, let's say 5 years younger, you wouldn't have been able to withstand?
That's a low level, what you find on social media, which I don't have any account on social media, so I'm less exposed to that, and I'm very grateful for that. I decided not to have any account when I married my wife. She asked me not to do that. And so I agreed not to do that, and that was more than 20 years ago. And I'm very glad that I don't have an account on social media, because then I can think creatively and not be affected. I mean, of course, I'm losing on some bits of information that are floating around on social media, but I benefit much more by not listening to low-level discussions. I'm keeping my eyes on the ball, so to speak, not on the audience. So that's one kind of pressure that you find on social media, but I'm sort of resilient to that, because I don't monitor it. But then there are, of course, there are other ways that people exert pressure through students and postdocs. They are much more vulnerable. They don't have secure positions. So if you create an atmosphere where some ideas are ridiculed, then postdocs and students are simply afraid of pursuing them because of their future careers. And I got a lot of emails from people saying, I completely agree with you, but I cannot express myself because I worry about my job prospects. And that comes from people that are not necessarily at the lowest level of academia. Even people that are, have secure positions are worried about that. And this is unhealthy, because we want an open discussion and a scientific discussion, a discussion based on content, not on the way things look like, or on personal attacks.